Happy Lunar New Year, and welcome to the Year of the Rabbit. Let's see some rabbit-related references and presentations this year. No more Sun Tzu stock phrases or Clausewitz cliches. Where are the leadership lessons from Watership Down, the social engineering tricks of El Arira, or the AppSec-like premonition from Fiverr? There isn't any danger here at this moment, but it's coming. Which means, this week we chat with Marudhamaran Gunasekaran from Practical Devsecops about crafting training programs to develop secure code and a security culture. In the news segment, more breaches, more SSRF, more identity management to solve, more web hacking techniques from 2022, and more. Follow the White Rabbit and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Invicti, AppSec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. This is episode 226, recorded January 23rd, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mr. Shima, good morning. I hope your pointers are warm and in good condition on this cold winter morning.
Indeed they are. Thank you very much. And listeners, do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of these shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Marudhamaran is a security consultant at Practical Devsecops with a strong passion for securing software development through training and consulting. He enjoys working with engineering and operations teams to seamlessly embrace the security mindset even before a single line of code is written. He's the developer and maintainer of the OWASP Zap.NET API, and you can find him speaking at various meetup groups and conferences on topics related to agile software development and security. Hello, Marudhamaran. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Pleasure to be here. Good morning, Mike.
It's wonderful to have you, and you've done a lot of training with development teams. You have a lot of certifications yourself that we'd love to get into. But first, let's set the stage about what those teams that you work with, the developers, what do they work on, and what are your typical areas of focus, which I think is, cloud native security. And tell us about APIs and containers in that area.
Thank you. Great. Over the years, I've worked with many development teams who have developed agile project management systems, telecommunication systems, and back-end billing systems, banks, many other systems, including the most recently, including the U.S. Department of Defense as well. But with all of these different teams, one thing was very common, that there are always developers who build code, and there are program managers that manage them. We call them product owners or business analysts or different stakeholders, different names, but developers are there, and then they write code, and many a times they don't know what is a secure code, and they don't really care about it. They're bogged down by deadlines. And with the word cloud native, we usually define that with 4 C's. First, you start writing code, and then the code gets built into a container image. That's the next C. And then the container image gets deployed into a cluster, such as Kubernetes or OpenShift. in a cloud somewhere. So when you talk about cloud native security, there's developers writing code, and maybe they're the ones that are actually packaging that code as microservices or small applications in those containers. And there's an administrator or a DevOps engineer or maybe a pipeline somewhere that deploys them into a cluster running on cloud. So to me, it's sort of end-to-end security. We've heard different terminologies come throughout the years. I'll talk about Devsecops or product security. The most recent one that I've fallen in love with is cloud native security, because it's, to me, it's the 4 C's that underline concept to cache, that is from code to the cloud, and clusters and containers in between.
Yeah, I like the 4 C's. I'm going to have to think of some good ways to riff off of that, from sea to shining sea. It's a nice developer-oriented way of thinking about it. And as you say with cloud native, I also just want to ask, this cloud native is an excellent description for what you were saying. Code turns into container to cluster to cloud infrastructure where it's living. That is something new. But is there something new on the security angle as well? If we say cloud native and the security aspect, can we point back to 20 years, training from 20 years ago or tenets from 20 years ago? Or does cloud native actually mean something new for security as well?
Indeed, very new. There are a lot of aspects that are particularly new. I think 20 years ago, when it was all IT, application development was very new, I guess. And 1995 so was Visual Basics. 2000s were .NETs and Javas. But during that time, application security was the new kid on the block, and people were trying to introduce application security. And fast forward to 2010, Azure and AWS came in, and that was the time of cloud. And then 2014 and 15 was the time of containers and container orchestrators, such as Kubernetes. So throughout these years, with secure development training or application security training in general, people were training developers about how to hack their own software, or, most secure code development trainings were about penetration testing trainings in different flavors. And that was what we saw 10 years ago. But then with cloud, there are new security challenges, and there's the quote that people often say that cloud does not solve all your security challenges, but it solves many, but it also brings its own security challenges. On that aspect, there are new areas of training that need to be developed for IT administrators to be wrapped up with the new cloud skill set. And build engineers all of a sudden were called DevOps engineers, and they had to move between Team Foundation Server and Jenkins, and now they had to pick up things like Dockers and Docker files and managing Linux servers on the cloud. And now they had a new operating system, and that's Kubernetes, which is an operating system for application deployment, for lack of a better word. And so training developers has changed throughout the period. Now, we as an organization developed training programs. We took a pause on consulting business for a while, and we're now translating our consulting experiences into learning experiences for our learners. And through that way, what we've come to learn is different developers and different administrators, they have different areas to focus on. So a big application security training program that is usually done for 2 or 3 days, that needs to be redefined into the context of what somebody is actually doing. Now, when we develop self-paced courses, it's a different approach. But when we go into organizations and develop custom training programs, then it's really, really tailor-made in terms of what that particular organization is working on. So after the 2 day of the training, or even in the 2 days of the training, we've seen people using some of the tools that we teach, not on the sample applications, but actually on their own applications. And this is achieved across all the four C's: code, cluster, containers, and cloud.
So that's I love that you brought in the fifth C also of context of, this is what, let's make it actual relevant to what the area of the developer is responsible for, what it looks like. And let's start to maybe break apart a lot of what you were describing at that high level of that evolution of the training. So it sounds like on one, you're no longer, with cloud native, you're no longer dealing with WSDLs or some ancient technology of
Right.
APIs, but maybe REST. But you talked about, one of the questions I'd like to go to is just, what is secure code? As you approach this training, what does that mean? Or how do you get to the sense of what does secure code look like, either as a goal as you're developing the course or for what developers just expect that they're walking into?
Right. One of the things that we always have in mind before we develop any kind of training program is people, before walking into a meeting room, they always wonder, what's in it for me? As a developer, I write code, I'm hired to write code, and I'm going into this security program. What's in it for me? So we sort of try and entice them in a little bit of ways. Of course, I'm using the word entice in a good sense. We approach the business owners and the people that hired us. We approach them, get access to their applications, do an initial assessment on their applications, and then find out a couple of low-hanging fruits, develop a proof of concept, exploit on their application, and then go into their rooms and then said, hey, we've been hired by your team, and we spent a couple hours or a couple of days on your app, and this is some things that we were able to discover. There is a lot more to discover, but we don't want to do it on our own because we've been doing that for a lot of years. We want to help you find the vulnerabilities in your application, and then we will discover ways of fixing them together. And that's one way that we've used to sort of get people interested in our training program in the first place. And it works 70 to 80% of the times, depending on the organization that you work with and the kind of developer culture that is present in that organization. But we've tuned this idea. The idea is to not send somebody into a room because their manager pushed them into a security program, but rather identify whether people are really interested in a training program or not, and kindle their interest in their own code, which has a lot of other benefits as well, which we can discuss if we have time.
So one of the things one of the topics that we brought up here is how to, one, you're describing how to tailor the program. And part of tailoring is, we'd love to hear that because different teams have different needs. You also need to pitch that program as well. And I'm sure that you've seen across different organizations, or maybe within the same organization, different teams have different needs, whether it's cloud native means, you mentioned build engineers at one point, but there may be front-end engineers and they may be the cloud engineers who are working on that environment with Terraform or whatever that environment looks like. So tell us a little bit, what's your experience been to tailor these programs, as well as making sure that the programs make sense for the managers of these teams too?
So I'll give you a little bit of background on why we started this approach. We were originally a consulting company, and we were doing training on the side. So I'm talking about my previous employer called Prowareness. It was a Dutch-based multinational corporation. And when, we've had a lot of offshoring development teams as well, using which we developed software for our customers. And we pitched in the idea of security and then tell them, hey, security is also very important. GDPR was also coming in back then. It was very new. So people felt the need to be compliant with security. Customers felt the need to be compliant with security. So there was a push somewhere behind the scenes. We've leveraged that. And then we said, all right, people think Devsecops is all about tooling, but there's also the cultural angle to it, which is very, very essential. And we got into this because of my background working with a lot of agile coaches, people that were working with Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. They were consulting our organization as well very closely. So we brought that angle of coaching into our security business as well. And that's one of the reasons we said, okay, it's great that we do vulnerability analysis and penetration testing and these integrations. After we disengage, how do we make ourselves redundant as consultants? We can only achieve that by training. And because we've spent enough time with your applications and teams, we know how to make a tailored program that will make it very, very effective for your team. And you mentioned front-end engineers in Terraform. So we've had, Scrum teams are cross-functional. They got people writing unit tests, developers, front-end quality assurance engineers. They're all part of that one single Scrum team, having all the capabilities to produce shippable software within 2 weeks. It was also a challenge to train that one single team. But in 6 months, we've developed a specific training program only for front-end engineers and UX designers, because user experience and security are often seen as two different edges, always moving further and farther apart. So we developed a training program specifically for the front-end engineers in the organization, because they came up with programs that said, you should specifically mention whether the user ID is correct or the password is incorrect, whether the user ID is incorrect and the password is incorrect. Well, there's a little bit of risk there. Somebody can enumerate users on your system if you tell them, well, they did not know that. And they've had things about front end showing masked data, but the backend APIs were actually showing the actual data, and they were all happening in the browser. So we discovered how an API security training could be delivered just for the backend folks. So it took the narrative I'm giving you took about 6 months to a year. And then finally, we've had these training programs. So it was largely based off of our consulting experience that we translated slowly into a team sitting in 3rd floor and 5th floor. And then we moved each floor up, training them. And then finally, we left that organization in a good place.
I'm curious to hear, I like those 2 examples you gave about, client-side masking, not the best approach if you're giving all that raw data from the API, because it ties back to an aspect you were talking about, teaching pen testing as a secure code training, which can be fun, but developers develop, right? And I'm not trying to be overly funny, even though I try all the time, but they don't pen test on a daily basis, right? And even pen testers don't pen test on a daily basis. They're reviewing code, they're reading code, they're writing documents. So tell us more about what that training content looked like, because it sounds like you were mentioning tools. Maybe tell us about some tools too. You're not teaching, secure coding isn't about becoming a pen tester for your own code.
Very great. We started off with SQL Map and the Z-Attack proxy and the Burp Suite, and installing Foxy Proxy in Firefox. During lunch session on the first day, we've had these conversations. These are great, but it's nice that you're teaching us, but I don't see how I can translate this learning into my everyday work. So that was real, and I'm keeping it real with you, and it's something that we had to learn. We thought we were going to do magic by teaching people security, but we had to realize it the hard way by actually doing it. And then we realized, okay, maybe this is not the right audience, so we cut off that. And this was based off of the concept that I think Jeremiah Grossman proposed in one of the TED Talks in 2008, where he mentioned hack yourself first before the actual hackers do, and Troy Hunt made Pluralsight trainings out of it. So the idea of our training was based off of all of these inspirations. But we had to find out, of course, developers write code, and it doesn't really work that way. Of course, they can have all of these tools installed, but it doesn't work that way. So that's where we sidelined and then integrated some of these tools into their CI/CD systems to give them feedback about how good they're coding. And so Zap had this baseline scan coming up in 2018. It was very new, and it runs for about a couple of minutes, and then it gives you your browser headers and insecure configuration. So that was one aspect of us realizing this is not an effective way to deliver that training. And another scenario, when we were training C++ developers about buffer overflows, they were overwhelmed by the amount of registers that we had to go through just to make a calculator pop up. And they said, why are you teaching us all this? It sounds it's not very interesting for us. But then we somehow pitched the idea of Stride in that. We, of course, before pitching in Stride, we mentioned, hey, there's also secure coding. If you have to know secure code, you have to start somewhere. You could use tools such as static analyzers to tell you how to actually write secure code. And they were also not very interested by that idea, but threat modeling seemed to interest that particular audience in that particular session. But for the other web-based developers that we were working with, we integrated some tools. And then what we also did afterwards is we said, okay, so here we have identified these 15 issues, and some of them are high and some of them are medium. Let's focus on how to build them securely. And that's where we brought in the angle of secure coding from penetration testing training. And then we replicated that idea. Before we walk into a team, we want to look good. We don't want to be the people that find faults in any applications. So if we sign a 3-month contract of secure SDLC, we first invite people for a 4-hour session, and this is a mandatory thing. Within the 4-hour session, we come in, we give some challenges to people and say, this is a vulnerable application, really vulnerable. You can have an LFI there. You thought your connection strings are secure, but there's an LFI using which people can download things. So we excite them in, and then we say, do you think this is translatable to your application? Sometimes people say, well, I'm doubtful. Sometimes people say, no, we've patched that. There was a pen test that already found it. We're aware of this vulnerability. So depending on those conversations, we tailored the program. And sometimes we spoke just with the team leads. Sometimes we spoke with the entire Scrum team.
I like those examples because, and I wanted to poke a bit at the threat modeling aspect too, because that's an area that I always perk up on. I enjoy threat modeling as well. And I'm curious, I think, especially with the LFI, it's like, here's an example of a flaw just to get your mind thinking, developers. If you're not used to that security minded thinking, here's an example, here's what it is, we could teach you, but does this apply to you, or how might this apply to you? That does seem like a reasonable approach. So I'd love to hear more about the threat modeling aspect and how you approach that. Did you have particular questions, particular tools for that matter, that help just with either teach what particular interesting attacks might look like, what particular threats might look like, or just the security-minded thinking of threat modeling in general?
Right. For us, the idea of doing a threat modeling session with this particular energy provider, it's part because the existing security officer came to us and then mentioned, hey, it's great that our company has hired you to help our teams build secure software. Just so you know, I did a stride session for 1 hour with these developers, and they don't do anything. They don't do anything after that. And to me, I was thinking, well, if you've done a 1 hour training session on threat modeling and you expect developers to pick up somewhere, it didn't sound like a reasonable expectation for us. So what we did, and again, we're all brought into the concept of, what value you are delivering on a daily basis, what value you are delivering on a weekly basis, and we have to present it internally with our organization as well. So a lot of training programs that we designed were around the applications that were present in that organization. So when we come into a threat modeling session, first 30 minutes or 20 minutes is going to be about Stride. Right? Just Stride, telling them examples. Say, okay, here's spoofing. Somebody can spoof your network packets. Somebody can spoof your MAC address. Somebody can spoof your address on the memory. We mentioned that. Those are a few examples. Somebody can spoof your user ID by a variety of attacks. Examples, 20-minute gather that attention, and then distribute either the OWASP cornucopia cards or the elevation of privilege cards. We've done it both online, we've done both offline, distributed to them. We didn't have an architecture diagram to start with. And we said, hey, we have people here, we have a whiteboard here, how about we get some architecture diagrams done? Because the architecture diagrams that they had apparently was with an architect who only worked for 3 days, who sat in some different office, and they were a couple of years old. Not very updated. So we drew diagrams, and then we got threat modeling session going. So it was not a traditional threat modeling training. It was an actual threat modeling session on their applications. And that's what, that's how we kindle that interest on that particular team that we were working with. And at the end of that 4-hour session, we've had about 10 or 15 we didn't gamify it like Adam Shostak recommends, giving points and writing them down. We just didn't do that. Giving the cards and giving developers the pointers about, hey, is this a thread? Does this apply to my application or architecture? That itself was an enough starter there. And then we've had about 10 or 15 Jira tickets, and those Jira tickets were addressed. Again, we get into the area of, we have 15. How are we going to address that? We say, okay, you have a big pizza. How do you eat? You dice and you slice, and that's what we're going to do. You take one issue every sprint, and if we're gonna fix that, we're good. That's the only deal that I'm going to make with you, or we're going to make with you as external consultants. One issue per sprint, and that's going to be about 5% of your capacity. Whether that's one story point or whether that's 5 story points, we just want 5% of your capacity. But
I like that. I want to say that there's a subtext there that you're using the language of developers. You're not saying, well, these have to be fixed within a 7-day SLA or a 30-day SLA or something that is security oriented that perhaps is arbitrary. You're working, if we're talking about sprints, kind of just a 2-week unit of time there, I'm going to guess, is pretty common. And just saying, here's our Jira backlog, let's work through it. That seems a good way to collaborate, engage developers on their language, how they work. I'm curious, though, you're describing something that's very contextual. That seems like you absolutely need to be hands-on, have someone who's teaching to moderate that discussion, just to ask those probing questions. How does this apply to your app? What about this? Let's talk about your architecture. So I'm curious if you have kind of a compare and contrast, perhaps. You had their 3rd floor team and a 5th floor team. I've watched Severance. I know how different teams can maybe compete against each other. Was there something that you learned, or was as a trainer, as someone delivering this type of training, that you would also recommend to others to watch out for or to adapt when you're just working with different groups within the same org?
Definitely. Great question there. Again, the 3rd floor team was developing the web platform, and then the 5th floor team was developing the mobile platform. We worked with the 3rd floor. We worked with the web team for about 6 months to 8 months. And I had the context of web application security in other areas. I did not know mobile security in 2017 and 18, but I've had a colleague who was an expert in that area. So we both worked together. It was a skill that I had to pick up by sitting next to somebody. And again, same applies to Docker, and same applies to containers, same applies to Kubernetes. We have to pick up our skills from somewhere, and the most efficient way would be to find a partner, hire somebody, or a junior or a senior, somebody knowledgeable in that area. Pick up that skill by working with different people, even though they might not be a good communicator or a conversationalist like you. They might know the technical know-how. Grasp it from them. Do a session together, and then identify those probing questions, because cross-site scripting doesn't really apply a lot to mobile applications. I mean, well, maybe subtly it does, but not really. But API security, that's very great. Greatly applies to mobile applications. Also APIs, but also web apps. But APIs are more and more consumed by mobile applications. They're everywhere. So, number one is to pick up a partner for you to work with while you're picking up a new skill, and then gather those probing questions together.
What it sounds like you're describing, I'm going to throw out that word, security champion, someone that you leave behind with the team who is an expert in some definition of expert to some degree on security, or at least knowledgeable about security, like you were saying. I would politely suggest that it's important to have communication skills, or at least the capability to learn those skills, rather than just say, just do security because I said so. As you were identifying those partners to, as you left, because you're not there working for those orgs the full time, what did it look like to identify those partners, and what was either success or something in hindsight 2020 that you would, done better?
Right. Right, and I'll take these fifth floor and the third floor example again. The web team that we were working with, it was a different vendor working for producing software for this energy provider, and the fifth floor also had a different vendor, and they've had different mindsets as well. One of the things when we started out to identify security programs, we were thinking of roses and blue skies and sunlight, everything great. Because I come from a development background and I thought security was great and I thought every other developer was going to be like me. But it wasn't the case. When we went out and said, this is a person, and I knew people who were genuinely interested in security, but at the same time, there was also lack of accountability because they were overwhelmed by various other job roles as well. So they just wouldn't come forward by themselves to take up this new role. We took that to the management, and the management simply said, well, you have Scrum Masters in a certain level. They're the ones that are accountable for Scrum. So make them the security champions. And we tried that approach because we didn't really have another way of trying. We tried that approach because it seemed to make sense, but I wouldn't say that was the most successful security champions program because they were forced into doing something by compulsion. But on the fifth floor team, when we did our initial 2 weeks of analysis, and when we presented some of our vulnerabilities, when we identified some vulnerabilities together on their mobile app and APIs, we asked who wants to be security champions, and we were blown away. We were perplexed. We didn't know what to do by their answer. They said, does it have to be one person in a team? And I asked, what's the reason you're asking? They said, so we all want to be security champions. That's what they said. And I still think about that day. It was the product owner that was there in that room. It was the Scrum Master that was there in that room. There was a QA analyst that was there in that room. A complete cross-functional team of 9 to 11 people. They said they all want to be security champions. And that was a different team. It was from a different vendor. They've had people from different age groups and maturity levels as well. But this team had a good connect and collaboration among themselves. They've had a good mindset of developers. So that kind of led us to, okay, why restrict security champions to one person when everybody wants to be a security champion? So we took those different approaches with different teams. We also realized that there is no one silver bullet that's going to work across the organization. So as we progressed through working with different teams, we worked with different approaches of identifying security champions and also working with security champions.
No, that's a great story, and I think it's a good lesson to hear that even within organizations, we start off talking about making code or making secure coding relevant to development teams, but even just the training itself and the approach to security champions possibly is going to have the context of just what are the teams themselves within the org. As we wrap up here, I'm curious. One of the things that we want to start to do is just kind of ask we're Application Security Weekly, and we've been talking about secure coding. If I asked you to describe AppSec in 3 words, what 3 words would you give us?
AppSec in 3 words. I'm going to pull a couple of options. I'm going to say build it secure, and another one will be build it right. And I can get philosophical and let's say save the world because software is eating the world, and that could also.
So we must save the world from the great software kaiju. Is that what we have to? I'm not sure. We'll have to work through the sense of that. But I love that. Also love the perspectives that you brought with us here. As another just final parting words, is there something you work with OWASP Zap, for example? Is there anything training wise or open source that you'd love to draw people's attention to over the next couple of months?
Attack proxy from a developer perspective as well, because the project founder Simon Benz wanted to build a tool that was focused on developers. It's great. GUI is great. And for containers, A lot for threat modeling. If you're on Windows, check out Microsoft Threat Modeling tool. And if you're on any platform, check out the free versions from threatmodeler.com and Irius Risk. You can sign up and you can build models very, very quickly. And it can generate you a list of threats, of course, which you will have to work through later to identify whether that applies to your application or not. But hey, free tools are great. You have to start somewhere. Pick up ZAttack Proxy. Check out the OWASP top 10 list for threat modeling. Check out the Microsoft Threat Modeler or Irius Risk or threatmodeler.com community editions.
Awesome. Thank you. And we'll make sure to throw those into our show notes as well, so everybody can find that and start creating some Jira tickets to go along with those threats. Thanks once again, Marudhamaran. That was a wonderful conversation to have you here with us.
Right. Of course. It's also been a pleasure, Mike and John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you all of our listeners. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.